Hi, everyone, and welcome to the Wildfire and Prescribed Fire Effects on Wildlife webinar series. My name is Corey Davis, and I am the Science Communication Specialist for the Northern Rockies Fire Science Network. And I'm happy to be here co-hosting this with the Association for Fire Ecology. I think we'll go ahead and get started. I just wanted to run through a few logistics items here real quick. First of all, if you're trying to connect through phone, your registration email should have the call-in info. And all participants are muted and screens off. This webinar is being recorded and it'll be eventually posted to our YouTube channel, and you can see the address there. And this might be a little different than some of the other webinars you've done, but please put questions for our speakers in the Q&A panel that you'll see on your menu there. It just helps us track the questions for our speakers a little bit easier than the chat window. You can still use the chat window for questions regarding logistics or if you have comments on anything, so still feel free to use the chat window. Closed captions are available if you just use the live transcript button that's also available in your menu. There are continuing education credits available from both the Wildlife Society and the Association for American Foresters. You'll need to submit a claim for that. I will turn in the registration lists, so they will have those, but you'll have to submit a claim on your own. And then finally, at the end, ask you to fill out the survey that pops up when you exit the webinar. I just want to say a couple of things about the Fire Exchange Network. So again, I work for the Northern Rockies Fire Science Network. We're one of 15 joint fire science program networks across the country. And what we do is we bring fire scientists and fire managers together through different activities such as field trips and workshops. And then we also have quite a few different products available, such as research briefs on the latest research coming out. We also do science reviews and videos, and yeah, just a lot of different products available on our website. And if you're not in the Northern Rockies, you can find your local Fire Exchange Network by going to the Joint Fire Science Program website. So with that, I'm going to hand it over to Gavin Jones, who's going to talk a little bit about the Association for Fire Ecology and introduce today's speakers. So go ahead, Gavin.
All right. Well, thank you so much, Corey. And could you go to the next slide? Thank you. So today's webinar is just the first installment of this 3-week series that we're putting on that is going to highlight some of the science that was featured in this special collection published in the journal Fire Ecology, and the special collection has the same title as our seminar series here, Wildfire and Prescribed Fire Effects on Wildlife. If you're interested in taking a look at the whole suite of science that was included in this collection, go ahead and follow that link there. And you probably can't click on it yourself, but it's a pretty simple link, so screenshot it or whatever, and go check out some of the papers that are in this collection. So this collection, it began as an outflow of a symposium that myself, Bryce Hanberry, Katie Greenberg, and Angela White put on at the Wildlife Society meeting in 2020, so a couple of years back now. But after that symposium, we thought it would be a great idea to collect some of this science into a special issue. And so we worked with the Association for Fire Ecology and the editor-in-chief, Bob Keane, of the journal Fire Ecology, to get this collection up and going. And so we've got 11 papers in this collection, and we are expecting a few more to kind of round out our collection in the near future. So really some exciting science in this special issue or this special collection, so go check it out. And this week, you'll be hearing some of the featured work from that collection. So could you go to the next slide now, Corey? All right, so just, we all love wildlife and fuzzy critters. And so this is just an example of some of the focal species that have appeared in some of the work in this special collection. Everything from brown bears to spotted owls to fruit bats, etc. So lots of exciting work in this collection that focuses both on individual species and also on whole animal communities. Next slide. And so with that, this is the overview of what you can expect both today, but also over the next several weeks. So please join in the subsequent weeks if this stuff sounds interesting to you. And today, we're going to be featuring 3 speakers, including Damon Lesmeister, Jonathan Dudley, and Susan Loeb. So I'm going to go ahead and introduce our first speaker at this point. So maybe we can transition over to Damon sharing his screen. And Damon also can turn on his camera and I'll turn off mine. So our first speaker today is Dr. Damon Lesmeister. And Damon is a Supervisory Research Wildlife Biologist with the USDA Forest Service in the Pacific Northwest. And Damon is going to be talking about northern spotted owl nesting forests as fire refugia. So go ahead, Damon, and take it away.
Great, thanks, Gavin. I appreciate that introduction. And I just wanted to confirm that seeing my screen okay.
Yep, we can see it.
Yeah, great. So, well, thanks. And I look forward to sharing some of the work that we've been engaged with here for the last several years to better understand the interaction between wildfire severity and forests that are used by northern spotted owls. And before I get started, I want to acknowledge my co-authors on this paper, Ray Davis, Stan Sovereign, and Ziquan Young. And I think it's probably best to put this up front as early, because there's various different definitions of what we might refer to, or we call fire refugia. So just to clarify, the definition that we're using in this paper is the landscape elements that remain unburned, burn less frequently, or burn at lower severity than the surrounding landscape. That last piece is particularly important for northern spotted owl nesting forests. It's potentially if they burn at lower severity than other forest types. It's sort of the broad question that we have. So northern spotted owls, imagine that most people are aware. They're an old forest obligate, and it's one of the most studied birds in the world. And the Cascades and the coastal mountains of the Pacific Northwest is probably the most important management species, and also was the catalyst for the development of the Northwest Forest Plan after the subspecies was listed as threatened in 1990. Populations have continued to decline. There's ample evidence to support that the populations are in really rapid decline. So in 2020, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service found that the subspecies warranted uplisting to endangered because this continued population decline and ongoing threats to the subspecies persistence. And it's driven by multiple stressors, barred owls, forest loss, both through timber harvesting and through wildfires. And wildfires can degrade habitat, and it's clearly a threat to spotted owls, and it's consistently listed as a primary threat, especially on federal forest lands. So I think we'll start to, I want to give you an idea of what is these forests that are used by northern spotted owls for nesting and roosting. And this is particularly why this subspecies is an obligate of old forest. So these are typically over 150 years old. Their stands have an average tree diameter of over 30 inches. Canopy cover is over 70%, and there are multiple canopy layers. And at times, and certainly in some conditions, these forests are often thought to be susceptible to high severity fire because of the high fuel loading, and multi-layered canopy potentially creates ladder fuels. But also important to note that these forests maintain moisture longer into the duration of the dry season. So, and the first paper that we published asking or trying to address these questions was from a wildfire complex that occurred in 2013. This occurred in it's called the Douglas complex. And this was a complex of fires that burned in one of our long-term spotted owl demography study areas in the Klamath-Siskiyou ecoregion. And it's highlighted there in that black box on the left map. And it's also, this map shows the fire regimes of within the northern spotted owl range. The area where this fire occurred is unique in that it's being this transition zone between the high frequency, low severity fire regime and the moderate frequency, mixed severity regime. It's also in the ONC lands. This is the Oregon, California public lands. And this is kind of that checkerboard pattern. And you can see this in this figure in the center there with the Douglas complex. You can see the gray and the white. The gray patterns that you see there are federally managed lands, and the white are non-federal lands. You can also see this from a satellite imagery to the far right. And you can see there's clearly a difference in those federally managed lands compared to the non-federal managed lands. And so this is distinguishable in the vegetation. And this fire provided a natural experiment for us to evaluate the fire severity and forest condition. This complex burned at mixed severity. It occurred in late August during a drought year and under high to extreme fire weather conditions. There were flame lengths of over 200 feet and in total about 38,000 hectares burned. So we published this paper in 2019. And what we found from this one complex of fires is that spotted owl nesting forest and these old forest conditions burned at lower likelihood than they burned at lower likelihood at moderate or high severity compared to low or unburned. And this was an opposite pattern that we observed with the unsuitable forests. So those unsuitable forests, they had a much higher likelihood of burning at moderate and high severity and less likely to burn at unburned or low severity. So this begged the question of, so we observed this pattern in this one fire in this one landscape, but would we observe these same patterns over many large wildfires over a long duration? So a 30-year period is what we were interested in. This is a period in which we had maps for spotted owl nesting forest. So we set out to do this work within the full range of the northern spotted owl. And you can see the map here. So this is all of Western Oregon, Washington, Northwest California. This is an area, there were 472 large wildfires that we included in the study. So each of those wildfires were over 200 hectares. We had annual maps of spotted owl nesting forest that go from 1987 to 2017. And most of the fires that occurred here were in the regimes of the low severity, very frequent. So these are frequent, so from 5 to 25 years. You can see this on the map on the right-hand side. So those are kind of that area that's in the red color. The next most common area where we observed these large wildfires were in the mixed severity frequent regime. So the frequency of about 15 to 200 years, and that's shown in the blue. And then the high severity infrequent fire regime were kind of in that gray area that you see on the right-hand map. All of the large wildfires are those black polygons that you see on the left side of the left map there. The green that you see there, these are all those environmental conditions that are suitable for these forests to develop into spotted owl nesting, roosting forests. They, in most cases, this were not the conditions, but at least have those suitable conditions to potentially develop into spotted owl nesting and roosting forest. So this is the context and the fires that we included in our study. Then we needed to classify these forests in some meaningful way specific to the question around spotted owl and spotted owl nesting forests. So we created 3 forest type classes. And we used the nesting habitat maps for each year from 1987 to 2017 from the Davis et al. To 2022. And this is the spotted owl habitat mapping, GTR. These occur every 5 years. We're publishing on spotted owl, the trends of spotted owl habitats. And so we lumped forest types into these 3 classes. One was the non-nesting forest. So these are forests that would not be suitable for nesting or roosting by spotted owls. So this is mostly younger and thin forests with low canopy cover. We also use the class of interior nesting forests. So these are suitable for nesting and roosting and at least 30 meters from non-nesting forest. And then the edge, this is that those edges are between the interior and the non-nesting forest. So these are pixels that were adjacent to at least 1 pixel of non-nesting forest type. And so this series of maps that you see here, this is the same landscape, and this is in relationship to the high resolution aerial imagery on the left-hand side. And then the binary map in the center, this is just classed into non-nesting forest types and nesting forest types, and then the 3 forest types there on the far right. And so the question that we had is, so we have these maps that were available pre and post fire. So we're able to look at how fires, what severity, these patterns of forest types, what relationship do they have with fire severity. So we had the wildfire data, and we used the landscape change and monitoring system, or the LCMS, from 1986 to 2017. And this gave us the ability to measure the extent and severity of wildfire. This is analogous to the MTBS data, but these were calibrated to local conditions and were also available for all the fires when we conducted this analysis. For the severity classifications, we used this, the Riley et al. 2017, this this RD-NBR severity classification. So the unburned and low, we use that class. These are areas where they're less than 25% of the basal area mortality. Moderate was 25 to 75% basal area mortality. And the high severity was the greater than 75% of the basal area mortality. So we used some selection ratios. This is from a lot of work by Manley and others. So we had this area burned ratio with the area available for burning, and I have the calculations here just for reference. But the way we interpret these selection ratios is this: if it's equal to 1, the severity of a particular forest type burning at any given severity. If it's equal to 1, then it's burning at the proportion available at that severity. And if you have this ratio that's above 1, then the severity within that forest type at a given severity is occurring greater than chance alone. And then this ratio that's less than 1, this forest type burning at a given severity, is occurring less than expected by chance alone. So this gives us a really effective way to be able to see these kind of general patterns that we're observing over these many large wildfires under different severities and different forest types. So here's some of the results that we have. These are the distribution of fires, and so this figure, it has for each year of the study from 1987 to 2017. The gray bars that you see, this is on the primary y-axis. So this is the area burned, so hectares. So larger bars, greater area burning. And so we go in some years where there was very little area burned to some years that we had over nearly 30,000 or 300,000 hectares burned in a given year. On the secondary y-axis, this is the number of large wildfires. So this is just a count of the number of large wildfires that occurred during that year. So generally you see a pattern. There's more acreage burned, more wildfires, but there are some years where there's just a fewer number of fires, but large fires. So 2002, I point you there toward the center, where I think there were 18 wildfires in 2002, but a large extent, nearly 200,000 hectares that were burned in 2002. And so here are the results of our burned area ratios. So I'll kind of walk through interpreting this figure. There's a bit going on, but I have it. If you focus there on the top left-hand side, we'll go through this. And so you'll notice there's a horizontal line there at 1. So this is basically an odds of even odds, basically. If the point is above 1, then you accept that you have greater odds of that forest type burning at that severity than chance alone. If the point is below the line, then that forest type at that given severity is occurring less than chance alone. And so the green squares that you see there, these are our interior forests. So these are our interior nesting roosting forests. The non-nesting are the gray circles, and then the purple triangles are the edge. So in that pool, this is where we're pooling all 472 wildfires, these 3 different forest conditions. The burn severities are 3 burn severity classes. So we see this pattern where the interior forest has a higher odds or higher likelihood of burning at low severity compared to the other 2 forest types, where the other 2 forest types right at even odds or just below. The interior has a lower odds of burning at moderate or high severity. And again, these others are somewhat slightly above 1, or the edge is sort of in that between where there's a bit even odds, but a bit higher probability or odds of burning, or the non-nesting forest types burning at moderate and high severity. Then we were interested in, well, how do these patterns hold in the different fire regime types? So you remember that fire regime map, we have the 3 different fire regime classes. And do we observe these? One of our hypotheses is that this would potentially break down in these low severity, very frequent regimes because of fire suppression. These are areas that typically would have experienced a lot of wildfire, but through fire suppression, there hasn't been as much wildfire in those landscapes as what would have historically been there. But they typically would have burned at low severity, but because of fire suppression, we hypothesized that those fires would burn hotter than expected alone. Then we would expect that they would burn hotter than historically. And we actually saw a kind of a strong pattern there with the interior forest really burning at even less or higher probability, high odds of burning at low severity, much lower odds of burning at moderate or high severity. And then you see a little bit stronger patterns with the non-nesting burning low odds at the unburned and low severity, higher odds burning at moderate and high severity. And then the edge is sort of in between those. So that's in that panel B there. That's the top right hand. And then we see the mixed severity. And then maybe the most interesting there is this high severity infrequent regime. So these are the areas where it's the moist forests. Fires don't occur very often, but when they do, they tend to burn really hot. And this is where we saw this sort of breakdown and difference, and certainly from the pool, where mostly it's a bit even odds for all the different severities by forest type. We actually saw lower odds of the high, the interior burning at high severity, but higher. The confidence interval does overlap one there, but there's definitely a lot of that weight would suggest that the interior forests were burning more, had a higher odds of burning at moderate severity. We're not really sure exactly why that is, and I think that warrants some further work. This is some work that we had done in this paper. We highlighted in this paper, and we were interested in trends, particularly in high severity fire. This is the one that we're really interested in. And are there trends in the different forest types, this high severity fire through time during this 1987 to 2017? And so you see on the left-hand side, this is the non-nesting, edge is in the center, and then interior on the right-hand side. And so this is the proportion of the area in the non-nesting, we'll start there on the left-hand side, that's burning at high severity. And we do see this positive trend in a greater proportion of the non-nesting forest that is burning at high severity compared to, if you compare that to the interior on the right-hand side, we're just not really seeing a pattern in the extent or the proportion of the interior forests that are burning at high severity fire through time. So we're interested in, so we see this very clear patterns that we have a higher frequency of the interior forests that burn at low severity, and then higher frequency of the non-nesting forests that burn at high severity. And so we were interested in, well, does this hold in those large fire years? So we picked the four largest fire years. That was 1987, 2002, 2008, and 2017. So for each of these each burned over 200,000 hectares of habitat-capable forests. And the fire severity frequency distribution patterns differed between forest types. So for the interior, the frequency distributions were consistently and most positively skewed and had the highest and the greatest kurtosis toward low severity. So you see that peakedness and the skewness of the interior forests of burning at low severity. So the interior forests are sort of that teal color, and then if that skewness would be the RDNBR to the left, you could see those interior forests they have the highest peak there in those low severity. For the non-nesting forest, the skewness was moderately positively and a little bit of kurtosis, indicating that there was more relative even distribution across the spectrum. But where we started to see this break down, these patterns of skewness and kurtosis were shown in those fire frequency severity distributions being the most bimodal during the two largest fire years of 2002 and 2017. And these were the areas the years that we had the Biscuit Complex and the Checo Bar fire. And this also had the highest burn with wildfire in our time series. So it seems as though under some conditions, under some threshold, we're starting to see a breakdown in this skewness and kurtosis for the spotted owl interior forest. So at some point, they sort of lose this resistance to high severity fire. And so in general, we asked this question of why would forests with high fuel loading burn at lower severity? And so our work and many others if you've ever been in the interior forest and the spotted owl nesting forest in the Pacific Northwest on a hot summer day, you've likely experienced this insulating effect, these multi-layer canopies. is high moisture retention, these very large logs. These areas, in comparison to the broader landscape, have higher relative humidity, lower temperature, lower wind speeds. All of those conditions then lead to lower severity fires. And these are all play a role in the fire triangle, result in this lower severity fire. And I'll just wrap up here. And so going back to this definition of wildfire refugia in these areas that experience less severe or frequent fire than the surrounding landscape, or than what we found in most large wildfires during this time series, that the forests that were used by spotted owls for nesting and roosting met this definition of fire refugia. But we do need a lot better understanding of fire severity variation within these interior stands, and where are those interior stands that tended to burn at higher severity compared to others. There's definitely a lot more work that's being done in this front, especially in the mapping and modeling of fire refugia. And where we had a bit of a, what we expect is going to be a breakdown, we have this breakdown in this spotted owl nesting forest serving this fire refugia, likely occurred in these 2020 megafires, where we have these 5 megafires in Oregon. We're just now starting to do work in understanding the how much of this nesting and roosting forest survived through these megafires that all burned at mostly high severity. And then with that, I think I'll take, or maybe I'll wrap up here.
Yeah, thanks, Damon. Appreciate it. Great talk. And we are going to move on to the next speaker at this point. So if you do have questions that you'd like to ask Damon, why don't you hang on to those for now? And at the end of the series of talks, we might have some time for those. So thanks a lot, Damon.
Yeah, thanks.
So now we're going to move on to John Dudley. So John, why don't you go ahead and share your screen? So our next speaker is Jonathan Dudley. Jonathan is an ecologist with the U.S. Forest Service's Rocky Mountain Research Station in the Wildlife and Terrestrial Ecosystems Program. And Jonathan is going to share with us his work. He and his colleagues work on prescribed fire limits, wildfire severity without altering ecological importance for birds. So go ahead and take it away.
Okay, yeah, thank you, Gavin. I'd first like to recognize my collaborators on this project. Koresh Latif is a quantitative ecologist with Bird Conservancy of the Rockies, and Vicky Saab is a scientist emeritus with the Rocky Mountain Research Station, and she was the lead scientist on this project. So the paper I'm presenting today was part of a larger research program that began in 2002 to study the effects of fuels reduction treatments on forest bird communities, and it was called the Birds and Burns Network. So today I'll be highlighting some of this research from central Idaho on the Payette National Forest, where following the prescribed fire treatments, a wildfire burned through our study area. My slide did not advance. Let's try this again.
Maybe try the arrow key, Jonathan. Try one of those.
There we go. It decided it wanted a different button. Okay, so that was my second slide. And so I'll just quickly restate, but so you have a visual, but this was originally the Birds and Burns Network, where we were looking at fuels reduction treatments. And we had a wildfire come through and burn the study area. There we go. Getting part of it. Interesting. So fire suppression and anthropogenic land use have increased wildfire severity in dry coniferous forests of the Western United States. And land managers typically use fuels reduction methods like prescribed fire to limit high severity wildfire and restore ecological function. However, many avian species are adapted to forest conditions created by high severity wildfire. And so to fully understand the ecological implications of fuels treatments, we need to know how prescribed fire modulates the effects of wildfire on bird communities. Get this to work. Interesting. Some issues. Here we go. Okay, the East Zone Complex was a mixed severity wildfire that burned approximately 235,000 acres on the Payette National Forest. And this was during the summer of 2007. And so, as I mentioned before, we had an ongoing study in this area looking at avian responses to prescribed fire when the wildfire started. And so we had 6 study units shown here in this left panel in the gray, of which 3 units had already received prescribed fire treatments, 1 unit in 2004 and 2 in 2006. And the wildfire burned through 5 of those units, which you can see from this red outline in a couple of locations there. And then I have a timeline here down below on the right, where the green portion of the line represents unburned, orange is the prescribed fire, and red is wildfire. And we conducted bird surveys from 2002 through 2010, and those were during the breeding season. And then we assessed the environmental effects of prescribed fire and wildfire using what's called the composite burn index, which is a measure of burn severity that incorporates aspects of canopy structure, understory cover, and downed woody fuels. Now, we analyzed bird species distributions in relation to wildfire burn severity using a community occupancy model. This model estimates species occupancy corrected for imperfect detection and is informed by repeat surveys across the breeding season. And then community level parameters allowed for information sharing across species, which allowed us to derive species richness. And we also structured the model to analyze shifts in occupancy along a burn severity gradient from before to after wildfire using a before-after control impact framework. This allows for stronger inferences of wildfire response than analyses of post-fire spatial relationships alone. So this figure shows the results of the composite burn index for the 3 fire conditions. We have here on the left the prescribed fire, and then in the middle wildfire units that were previously treated with prescribed fire, and then on the right wildfire units that were not previously treated with prescribed fire. And so you can see that burn severity overlapped at all 3 conditions, but wildfire reached greater severity in the untreated units that were not initially treated with prescribed fire. Okay, this figure illustrates the range of responses following wildfire for 60 bird species that we observed in units that were previously treated with prescribed fire, which is shown here on the right panel. And with those that were not, species that were in, and not previously treated, with prescribed fire shown on the left panel. So we had treated on the right, untreated on the left. And the species names are consistently the same. Now the X axis represents species shifts to the right of zero, shift in occupancy towards high severity sites, and values to the left of zero suggest shifts away from high severity sites. And the orange and blue error bars indicate statistically supported species shifts. And so when you compare both panels, the species responses were generally similar, whether wildfire sites were previously treated with prescribed fire or not. This to work. There we go. And so here are examples of 3 species, the house wren and hairy woodpecker at the top here, and the Townsend's warbler down at the bottom that consistently exhibited strong shifts after wildfire. Just to work again. There we go. And 3 species, the warbling vireo, mountain chickadee, and Cassin's vireo, whose shifts were dependent on treatment. And so it's important to note when you look at these and compare kind of these general relationships that no species exhibited completely contradictory responses. For example, we're shifting away from the untreated wildfire effect and towards the treated wildfire effect. And so in general, species responded to wildfire in concert with their life history traits, where, for example, several woodpecker and secondary cavity nesting species, aerial insectivores, and understory species exhibited positive effects of wildfire, and where canopy nesting species and foliage and bark gleaning insectivores exhibited negative effects of wildfire. So on average, species richness increased somewhat after wildfire by approximately 5 species, and richness was lower at sites burned at higher severities. That's what these are showing here. Basically, this was also the case before wildfire, so there was no shift in species richness between high and low severity sites after wildfire, so no change in this slope of the 2 lines here. So there wasn't much of a response where birds were most species rich. And even though we're not showing it here, because species responses to overall wildfire were similar, the richness pattern you see here was also the same whether sites were previously treated with prescribed fire or not. So in conclusion, our results showed that prescribed fire limited subsequent wildfire severity in our treated study units, that bird species responded to wildfire based largely on life history traits and in similar patterns, whether units were previously treated with prescribed fire or were untreated. And there wasn't much of an effect of wildfire on the distribution of where birds were most species rich, with only a slight increase after wildfire. And this was the case regardless of previous treatment with prescribed fire. Our results suggest that managers can use prescribed fire to reduce fuels and limit severity of wildfire without completely compromising its value to fire-associated species. However, because prescribed fire is limited to smaller landscapes, it's unlikely to function as an ecological surrogate for wildfire, but more rather influence the extent and severity of wildfire while maintaining biodiversity. And with that, I'd like to acknowledge several people that were instrumental in seeing this work completed: Anna Agnew and Sam Hescock on the Payette National Forest, and Scott Story, who led field crews for a number of years. And we had many technicians who worked hard to collect the data. And then I'd also like to acknowledge the Joint Fire Sciences Program, National Fire Plan, and Rocky Mountain Research Station for funding this project.
All right. Thank you so much, John. Appreciate it.
Yeah, sorry for some of the glitching.
It comes with the territory.
Yes.
So we do have a few minutes here, which is really lovely. So if anybody has any questions for John, feel free to drop them in the chat. And it looks like we have a raised hand. So let's try to make that happen. Let me try to fumble around here with the, here we go. I think I can ask to unmute. So Russ Thoreau. Let's see if this works. Russ, I'm trying to let you.
Russ, see if you can unmute yourself.
Okay, can you guys hear me?
I can
Yep.
hear.
Yes?
Yeah,
Yes.
we can hear you.
Yes.
Is there a delay? So I wanted to ask John to comment about the edge effect of burned and unburned, and you know how that mosaic influences not only bird diversity but maybe abundances of certain species.
I'm not sure I understand your question.
So you look specifically at fire. What about the unburned areas and their importance in relation to the burned areas?
Good question. Not quite sure how to answer that. Certainly, we saw variation in bird abundance, and some birds did not respond either towards or away from high severity, but this particular project wasn't necessarily focusing on, you know, particular edge or not, or unburned in that case. I'm not sure. Does that answer your question?
Well, I guess what I'm asking is, would there be a difference in the response to burns in areas where you had unburned areas adjacent versus much larger areas of burn?
Well, I think yes, we would, you know, think that might be the case. But this paper specifically, I don't believe is addressing that. But yes, we would see some species that they would respond in both directions, likely, as the structure and composition of the forest may have been influenced by the fire.
All right. Well, thank you, Russ, for that question.
Yeah.
We are going to move on now to our final speaker of the day. So let's have Susan Loeb go ahead and jump on here. And Susan, if you can turn on your video and share your screen, we'll get going with your talk.
Okay.
So our last talk for this first session is Dr. Susan Loeb. And Susan is a research ecologist with the Southern Research Station. And she's going to be talking about bats and fire, what we know and what we need to know. And I just realized we've done a little bit of a U.S. Forest Service Research Station tour today. So now we're stopping in the Southern Research Station. So go ahead and take it away, Susan.
Okay, thank you very much, Corey. So I'm going to take a little bit different approach today and give you an overview of bats and fire. And this is a paper that was in the special issue that Gavin mentioned before. And so if there's anything that piques your interest that I gloss over today, please go to the paper. You can get more details and also get all of the references that I'm talking about today. And what Rachel Lakey and I did in this review was to find all of the papers we could and 3 theses that addressed bats' responses to fire, whether that be prescribed fire or wildfire. And these papers came from across the globe, although primarily came from North America and Australia. As you can see from the graph on the right, this topic has there's been a lot more interest in this topic over the years, particularly over the last 5 or so years. And particularly the last couple of years, looking at the responses of bats to wildfire. And that is unfortunately due to some of these mega fires that we've had in both Western North America and Australia, which has provided the opportunity to address that question. So before we get into the main question, which is, does fire have a positive or negative impact on bats? One question that arises is, why bats? Why do we even care? Well, they are the second most diverse group of mammals with over 1,400 species. They inhabit almost all the ecosystems on Earth. They provide very important ecosystem services such as insect control, pollination, and seed dispersal, as well as others. But many of these are declining and are considered threatened or endangered. So it's important to understand how our actions, either through prescribed fire or inadvertently through wildfire, affects these animals. So getting back to the main question, does fire have a positive or negative impact on bats? And the answer is, as it often is, it depends, which I know is not a satisfying answer to managers, but is unfortunately the reality. And it depends on such things as the type of fire, whether it's prescribed fire or a wildfire, the extent of that fire, various time factors such as frequency, time since the burn, and fire return interval. When did that burn occur within the year, the severity and intensity, and then how do all of these factors vary across space and time, i.e. pyrodiversity. So first addressing that first question in terms of prescribed fire versus wildfire. And generally what we found looking across these 50 some odd papers and theses was that bats tend to show a neutral or positive response to prescribed fire. This is usually attributed to the fact that the prescribed fire goes through, it reduces a lot of the clutter within the forest, particularly really dense forests, and this increases the foraging efficiency for bats. They don't have to deal with as many physical obstructions, and also their echolocation is not being messed up by all of these obstructions. Oftentimes there is also an increase in insect abundance, although in some cases there is a decline. When it comes to wildfires, again, we oftentimes see a positive response to wildfire, but there across the studies, we see far more negative responses to wildfire than we did for prescribed fire. Another factor that can affect bats' responses to wildfire and any type of fire, is the burn extent. How large is that burn? There's limited data out there and a wide range across those studies in terms of the extents study. But what we again tend to find is either a neutral response to the size of the burn, or even sometimes a positive response. So the larger the burn, the greater use of the habitat. But again, this varies with whether it was a prescribed fire or a wildfire. And that is, in some respects, due to the extent of prescribed fires versus wildfire, with prescribed fires often being conducted at the scale of hundreds to thousands, to maybe 10,000s of hectares, whereas wildfires can be at the much larger extent in terms of hundreds of thousands of hectares. The question is going to arise in terms of, as fires get larger and more intense, at what point do those increasingly large fires start to impact bats? Another factor that we see a lot of variation in is in terms of the time scale and the frequency of burns. So this variation is related to the species that is examined, when that burn occurred, the management history before that burn occurred, whether it was prescribed fire or wildfire, and the time span examined. So sometimes people are looking at the scale of weeks to months, others are looking at decades. So just an example of differences between species and how this relates to the ecology of the species. So in the upper right, we have the evening bat. This is usually considered a woodland species or an edge species. And this was a study done in central Missouri. And what you see here is that these bats were more likely to occupy sites that had burned 6 to 8 times over the last 10 years versus those that had been burned only a couple of times. So again, this makes sense. These bats like open woodlands. More fires, the more open that woodland is. On the other hand, we've got this gray long-eared bat from Europe, which is a clutter-adapted species. It likes denser forests. It gleans insects from vegetation. You clear out the forest too much, and it will avoid areas that have been burned too many times. There's also the factor in terms of when do we measure bat responses relative to the burn. So this is a study from Italy where a severe wildfire went through Mount Vesuvius National Park, and they had been monitoring bats prior to the burn and then 2 years post-burn. And some of the bat species showed the same type of activity in the burned and the controlled areas pre and post-burn. But some of the species showed considerable negative response 1 year post-burn. So these are the ones that I have outlined in orange. But 2 years post-burn, the activity in those burned areas returns to pre-burn levels. And the same thing occurred with reproduction. So 1 year post-burn, the proportion of females that were in reproductive condition was significantly lower than pre-burn times. But 2 years post-burn, they were back to their pre-burn conditions. So when we measure bat responses is really important to understanding of these relationships. The season of burn has not received a lot of study, but probably needs a much greater. But this is just an example of the Florida bonneted bat. And what we see is a very different response in terms of whether the burns were conducted in the early wet season versus a dry season. And the early wet season is when fires historically burned in that area. So we tend to see a more positive response to more frequent burns during that historical fire regime period. When we look at severity and intensity of burns, this varies a bit by whether it was a prescribed fire or a wildfire. So looking at those studies that have looked at prescribed fire effects and looked at severity and intensity, 2 of the 3 studies that have looked at that found negative responses by small clutter adapted species. So these are species that like more clutter, they like more vegetation in the forest that they are using. Whereas the large open space foragers that are very strong flyers, they tend to prefer those more severe fires. And when we look at wildfire responses, first of all, there was considerable variation across the several studies that have been done looking at the response of severity and intensity. But again, what we see is variation among species. And so a number of species responded positively to greater severity of the burns, but there were 3 species that tended to show negative responses. And again, 2 of these, the canyon bat and the small-footed bat, tend to be on the much smaller side of body size. So body size and ecomorphology play a big role here. Other factors that play into this variation in terms of responses to severity and intensity include the time since last burn. So whether you're measuring this 1 year post-burn or several years post-burn, responses will vary. Also, the landscape factors. So one study that was done in Arizona in a very dry area, it turned out that water availability was a far more important factor explaining the variation in use than severity. Landscape composition is also important, and also the response examined. So most of the studies that I've talked about thus far have looked at foraging. Most bats, or not most bats, but a lot of species, a lot of forest species will roost in trees during the summer. So if we look at this one nice example from Australia, where a severe wildfire went through and they looked at roost selection in unburnt, low to moderate severity burns and high severity burns, what we see is these bats essentially completely avoided roosting in high severity burns, although they did use the low to moderate severity burns as well as unburnt areas. So roosting may be a far more sensitive response to be looking at than foraging. And then finally, we've got pyrodiversity, which we defined, or we used the definition of spatial and temporal variability and post-fire landscape characteristics. And this study in Western North America looked at species richness across severity indices and pyrodiversity. And what you see is no matter what the severity, there was greater species richness in the more diverse, pyrodiverse landscapes than in the low and medium pyrodiverse landscapes. And again, we tend to see variation among species. So some species showing positive responses to greater pyrodiversity and others showing negative responses. So going back to, does fire have a positive or neutral or negative effect on bats? It all depends. Are you looking at single factors or interactions between factors? And it appears that our answer oftentimes depends on those interactions between factors. So the season of burn and the frequency, or the season of burn and other management that has occurred, and the severity and time since last burn, and a number of other factors. Also, we're dealing with limited data. Across the globe, we can only find 50 some odd papers. And so there's a bias in terms of the species that have been looked at, and the locations and the types of fires. So just focusing in on North America, you can see that in the Eastern United States, we know an awful lot about how bats respond to prescribed fire. Very little, if anything, about how they respond to wildfire. On the other hand, in Western North America, we have lots of species, or relatively a lot of species, looking at responses of bats to wildfire, but no studies looking at the response of bats to prescribed fire. So some of the future work, I've talked about bats' response after the fire. We don't know much about how bats are responding during that fire and how many bats are actually dying. We do know that bats in the eastern United States will roost in the litter. And so that's during the spring and winter. So it is not uncommon for bats to come flying up during a prescribed fire. How many bats do not fly up? Also, the pictures on the left show some raffinette-figured bat roosts that I was monitoring that were actually destroyed by a prescribed fire. I mentioned some of the bias here in terms of most of the studies being conducted looking at bats foraging responses to prescribed and wildfire, but we know very little about how they respond in terms of reproduction and survival, physiology, demography. And we have some studies on roosting and roosting habitat, but roosting is probably a far more sensitive response than foraging. And then finally, how is climate change going to affect these relationships that we are starting to understand? Will these relationships change? Will the intensity and severity of fires increase? Will the extent increase? And how will this interact with drought? So most bats are dependent on free water. Their reproduction in drier areas is highly tied to the amount of water out there, as is their survival. So when you stress the bats just due to drought, then you stress them possibly with some very large wildfires. We don't know how that will affect them. And then finally, pyrodiversity may be a way for us to look at these various interacting factors, but what scale should we be looking at when we're asking the question about pyrodiversity? And how do we even measure pyrodiversity? And finally, how do we manage for it? So I don't know if there are any time for questions, but I will take any if there are.
Right. Thank you, Susan. So at this point, we do have 20 more minutes in this room for this week's installment of our seminar series. And so right now it's a time for open Q&A. So there are a couple questions in the Q&A box that I'm going to ask here of our speakers. And as we're asking these first questions or listening to the answers to these first questions, please feel free to drop additional questions you have in the chat. If we don't get to all of them, then we will, or rather, if the speakers can answer the questions in the Q&A directly as well, if we can't get to all of them live. So go ahead and drop additional questions in the chat, and I'll ask that perhaps the speakers can turn their cameras back on for the Q&A, just in case there's a question that comes your way. And also, so I'm not the only person on here. So our first question is for Damon. So I'm going to read this question from Allison Dean. Damon, would you attribute the, quote, breakdown in resistance to simply hotter, drier summers with diminished live fuel moisture? Or are you starting to see increased mortality in drought-stressed trees as a cause of fires overcoming that resistance? Oh, and Damon, you are definitely not on mute, but I can't hear you, and I'm not sure if anyone else can either. Okay, I'm seeing a head shake, so your microphone might not quite be working. So let's, nope, still can't hear you, Damon. As we're, maybe Damon, you can fiddle with your mic settings or something like that or whatnot, but as we're waiting for that, let's go to another question that is in the webinar chat for Susan. So Susan, what do you recommend are the top 3 research needs for bats in Western forest landscapes, particularly related to drought? That's from Leslie Hay.
Oh, hi Leslie. Good question. That's a tough one. So I think, wow. I I think we need a better understanding of bats' use of water sources across the landscape in Western. We know they are drawn to them, and also understanding how their foraging habitat use will change relative to changes in water availability, and also how their roosting habitat or roosting selection is going to change relative to water availability, and how that's going to vary across species. So, and again, how their reproduction is tied to it. So we have a few studies on that. And there was a really nice paper looking at that modeled drought responses and how drought is going to affect bats in the future. And I can drop that reference into the chat. It's also in that paper that we did. Okay.
Great. Thanks, Susan. Should we try Damon again? Nope, still nothing. Hey, Damon, if you want to try to answer your question in the Q&A, I think you should be able to type an answer to that. So you can go ahead and drop that in, and I can try to communicate that in a little bit. Okay, so next question, and this is one that maybe is for all of the panelists or perhaps others as well. This question from Dave Jones: do firefighters consider letting good fire or low intensity portion of a wildfire burn to help the ecosystem and restore balance while fighting or extinguishing bad fire or high intensity burn portion of a wildfire? So any of the panelists want to take a crack at that?
I'm not a fire manager, but my experience is that yes, they will often call wildland fire use to let the wildfire essentially do its work on the landscape.
Great. Anyone else want to add to that? I'll add. I guess Damon can't add, but I'll add to that. That yeah, I agree. I agree with Jonathan's assessment. Oftentimes, you know, when fire burns across large areas, you know, low and moderate or mixed severity, it's able to cover a lot more acres than we're able to cover doing mechanical fuels reduction and things like that. So absolutely, I think there's a growing recognition of the good stuff that fire can do out there in the landscape that can help meet the resource objectives. So great question. Again, I'm not a firefighter, so it'd be great. It'd be really interesting to hear from somebody who is out there on the fire line, does this kind of work. But from my perspective, that's definitely something that people are aware of and are working to facilitate. Damon, you're on now.
Yeah, I've given up on my headset. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Oh, okay, great. Yeah, so the question was about this sort of breakdown in resistance, and then some years under some fire, these really extreme, especially like mega fire type conditions where we see this breakdown in resistance of spotted owl nesting forests. So I can't speak to drought stress trees and effect that may have on the these patterns in resistance. So I can't speak to that, but there is it seems to be a very clear pattern in that in some of these years, particularly when we get these east wind events, these are these really extreme wind events where we have these really dry conditions and very high. So these kind of wind-driven fire events, those are the events when we particularly see this breakdown. And we've already done some. I want to speak to this, not yet published, but from the 2020 fires, I will say that the patterns that we observed in these more sort of normal fire conditions that we observed over this 30-year period from 1987 to 2017, I will say those patterns, those break down when we get these really extreme, and we know this just from historical, you will get historical forest mapping and that, where we had these really large mega fires in the mid 1800s and the early 1900s, that we just lose these forests, and there really isn't any of those forest conditions. Basically everything, or the vast majority of things, burn at high severity, even in these forests that are quite resistant, these moist forests that are in this high severity, low frequency. So these forests, like return intervals of over 200 years, those forests don't burn very often. But if you can get them to burn hot, and that's where you see these stand replacing fires. So, but yeah, I don't know about the specific to the drought. That is the area that we're covering. So,
Great. Thanks, Damon. Just to close a loop on the previous question as well, Allison Dean just replied and to Dave's question about firefighters letting good fire burn. Allison says, Dave, yes, we do try to let natural fires burn where and when we can. Limitations include high risk levels at some times of season, presence of urban interface, and whether or not there's a planning document in place that allows for that particular use or treatment of public land. So thanks, Allison, for adding some additional detail there from your perspective. So another question for Susan. So Susan, curious about, and this is from Matt, and I can't see Matt's last, Matt Slifko. Curious about any studies focusing on how fire, wild and prescribed fire, influences the spread of white nose syndrome, for better or for worse.
Yeah. No, not in terms of the spread of wildfire. I mean, spread of white nose syndrome. We are now looking, my student just put together his data so that tricolored bats are preferring in the spring and fall when they are, well, particularly in the fall when they're preparing to go into hibernation and hopefully getting more fat, they are preferring to use those stands that have been burned previously. So providing better foraging habitat, they can be in better condition when they go in and start dealing with the fungus.
Great, thanks, Susan. And just as a little teaser for next week, one of the speakers we're going to be hearing from is Dr. Greg Albery, who's a disease ecologist at Georgetown, and he's going to be talking about his review paper published in this special collection with the title "From Flames to Inflammation: How Wildfires Affect Patterns of Wildlife Disease." So there are certainly some interesting interplays between disease ecology and wildfire that I'm not very up to date on. So I'm excited to hear about Greg's work next week as well. Maybe there'll be some other insights that we brought from that as well. So thanks, Susan. Okay, another question for Damon. So Damon, you're on the hot seat now. This is from Aja Woodrow. So Damon, Aja says, "Hi, Damon. I'm curious about second order fire effects on refugia. Is there a way to do a before-after analysis at the 5-year post-fire time step? Have you explored this topic? My observation is that taller trees die slower than shorter trees, given a similar flame length, so delayed mortality."
Yeah, I think that's a great question, Asia, and it is something that is certainly in our list of follow-ups and continued questions that sort of delayed, degrading spotted owl nesting forest post-fire. And so what we were in this study in particular was the immediate effect of fire and the severity. We're really interested in this pre-fire forest conditions, and then we have a wildfire, and what relationship did we have, if there was any patterns that we would observe in fire severity based on the current forest conditions. We're really interested in spotted owl habitat, addressing the more narrowed question about the does spotted owl nesting forest function as a refugia, at least in some degree, under what conditions, and we have some more follow-up to do that. We haven't done as much work on the conditions of the forest years post fire, but that is certainly is an important question.
Great, thanks, Damon. And Asia put in the chat is actually burned available, not before or after. I misinterpreted the B/A, but I don't know if that would change your answer or not, Damon.
Oh, yeah. So this is the those are the area, burned at a particular forest type, severity, given its availability within the fire perimeter. It goes back to the manly selection ratio. So yeah, kind of a wildlife person. So that's kind of what we.
Great. All right. Well, I don't see any other questions in the chat unless I've missed one. I see a question here in the question answer from Rex. I can address that quickly here, Rex McGraw. So Rex, we used a smaller pixel, so we used the 30 by 30 meter pixels. Great. All right. Thanks, Damon. So with that, I think that is it. So I'm going to pass it over to Corey. Corey, do you have any closing remarks or want to close us out?
Yeah, hey, everybody. That was great. Thank you to all of our speakers today, and Gavin for being the facilitator. Did a great job. And yeah, I hope you'll join us next week, next Monday, for speakers we've got lined up. And again, this has been recorded, so we'll put the full recording up on our YouTube page here coming in the next week or two. So again, thanks everybody for joining us, and hopefully we'll see you next week.